"Don't make a sound," she breathed against his ear. "They'll kill me if they find me." Nathaniel Brooks had never seen this woman before in his life. She was hiding in the back of his carriage, one boot missing, wedding dress, torn hands, shaking like the last leaf of October. Outside, armed men were moving carriage to carriage, searching every vehicle leaving Willow Creek. She grabbed his sleeve. "Tell them I'm your wife, please. I have proof of everything. But if they take me back, that proof disappears with me." He had 4 seconds to decide. He climbed onto the driver's seat and never looked back. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel and follow every twist to the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Nathaniel Brooks had not spoken more than 30 words to another human being in 11 days. He knew this because he counted. Not out of loneliness, he would have argued against that word until his last breath, but because silence had become the only honest thing left in his life. Words were where people hid. Silence was where they couldn't. He had come into Willow Creek for one reason only: supply run. Flour, salt, lamp oil, 2 boxes of rifle cartridges, and a bolt of wool fabric his ranch hand Marcus had asked him to pick up for a saddle repair. Nathaniel had a list. He had a schedule. He intended to be back on the road before the afternoon light started going gold, which in mid-October in Colorado meant around 4 o'clock. He did not intend to save anyone. He never did. It just kept happening anyway. How was loading the last crate into the back of his carriage, a covered 2-horse rig, practical rather than elegant, the kind of vehicle that announced a working man rather than a wealthy one, when his hands closed around something that wasn't a supply crate. A wrist. Thin. Cold. Very much alive. Nathaniel did not shout. He did not stumble backward. He simply went very still, the way a man goes still when he has spent enough years around unpredictable animals to understand that sudden movements make dangerous situations worse. He pulled back the supply blanket. A young woman stared up at him. She was perhaps 22 or 23, though her eyes carried something older than her face suggested. Dark brown hair, half pinned and half fallen, framing a face that was pale, not from illness, but from terror. She was wearing what had once been a white dress, the kind a woman might wear to a formal occasion. High-necked and buttoned carefully, but the left sleeve was torn nearly to the shoulder. There was a long scrape of dirt across the bodice, and one of her boots was missing entirely. She had been running, not leisurely, not carefully. Running the way a person runs when they have nothing left to lose but their life. Before Nathaniel could form a single question, she moved. Her hand shot out and wrapped around his wrist, her grip surprisingly fierce for someone so clearly exhausted, and she pulled herself upright just enough to bring her face close to his. "Pretend I'm your wife," she whispered. "Until we get out of town. Please." Nathaniel stared at her. "I don't know you," he said. His voice came out quiet and flat, the same tone he used when he was working through a problem that required careful thinking rather than fast reaction. "I know you don't." Her eyes didn't waver. "But there are men at the end of this street, and they are going to search every carriage leaving town, and if they find me alone, I will not make it through this night. I'm not asking you to fight anyone. I'm not asking you to do anything except sit beside me and say I belong to you." "You don't belong to anyone," Nathaniel said. Something shifted in her expression. For just a fraction of a second, the terror cracked open, and something else showed through surprise, and then a pain so deep it looked almost like grief. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." Nathaniel heard the boots before she finished speaking. 3 men, maybe 4. Moving with the deliberate, organized pace of people conducting a search rather than a casual walk. He could hear the sound of carriage doors being opened, voices asking questions, the particular kind of noise that organized hostility makes when it's trying to sound official. He looked at the woman. He looked at the end of the street. He made the calculation, the way he made all calculations, quickly, practically, without sentiment, and then he pulled the blanket back over her, tucked the edge down over her feet, where the missing boot would have given her away, and climbed back up onto the carriage seat. "Don't move," he said. "Don't speak. And for God's sake, breathe quietly." The men who stopped him were 3 in number. The one who approached the carriage first was built like a man who had spent a lot of years doing physical work, and an equal number of years convincing himself he didn't have to anymore. He wore a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, but it was pinned at an angle careless, the way a man wears an authority he borrowed rather than earned. His 2 companions stayed back watching the street in both directions. "Afternoon," the man said. He didn't say it pleasantly. "Afternoon," Nathaniel replied. "You leaving town?" "That's generally what leaving town looks like, yes." The deputy's eyes narrowed slightly. He was the kind of man who didn't like being answered with more words than he used. "We're looking for someone. Woman, young, brown hair, wearing a white dress. You see anyone like that?" Nathaniel considered the question for exactly the right amount of time, not too fast, which would suggest rehearsal, and not too slow, which would suggest guilt. "Can't say I have," he said. "I've been at the supply store most of the afternoon. Didn't pay much attention to who was walking around." The deputy looked at the carriage. "That your rig?" "It is." "Who else is traveling with you?" And here was the moment. Here was the exact point where Nathaniel Brooks could have said nobody. Could have said just me. Could have said anything that was factually, technically, literally true, and driven away and gone back to his 11-day silence and his carefully scheduled life and his very strong preference for not involving himself in other people's disasters. "My wife," he said. "She's resting in the back. She gets headaches on long rides. I'd rather not disturb her." The deputy studied him. Nathaniel held his gaze and did not blink because he had learned long ago that the most convincing lies are delivered by people who have convinced themselves they're telling the truth. And in this particular moment, Nathaniel was telling himself a very simple truth. This woman is frightened, and frightened people deserve the benefit of the doubt before suspicious ones do. "What's her name?" the deputy asked. "Clara," Nathaniel said, the name she'd given him. "Clara Brooks." The deputy held his position for another 5 seconds. Then he stepped back and waved Nathaniel through. Nathaniel flicked the reins. The carriage rolled forward. He did not exhale until Willow Creek was a quarter-mile behind him. He took the mountain trail instead of the main road, longer by 40 minutes, rougher underfoot, almost entirely unused since the first snowfall of the season, because the main road had 2 more checkpoints, and he had already used up whatever supply of convincing lying he possessed for the day. The carriage tilted and jostled over frozen ground. The horses complained. Nathaniel let them. When he judged they were far enough from town that sound wouldn't carry, he said, "You can sit up now." There was a rustling from behind him. Then a long pause. Then the sound of someone trying very hard not to cry and almost succeeding. "Thank you," she said. Her voice had steadied itself considerably, which told him she was the kind of person who gathered herself quickly after being undone. He noted this. It was the kind of thing worth knowing about a person. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I want to know what's happening before I decide whether I did the right thing." Another pause. "That's fair. Start from the beginning. The beginning is complicated. I have 40 minutes before we reach the fork in the road, where I'll need to decide whether to take you back toward town or farther away from it. So you have 40 minutes to make it less complicated." He heard her pull in a breath, and then she started talking. Her name was Clara Bennett. Her father was Thomas Bennett, who had owned 37 acres of farmland on the eastern edge of the Willow Creek Valley. Not a large holding by Colorado standards, but a good one fed by a tributary of the Gunnison River that ran through the property's northeast corner, which meant reliable water even in dry years, which meant the land was worth considerably more than its acreage suggested. Thomas Bennett had been a careful man, a quiet man. The kind of man who kept his accounts in 3 separate ledgers and stored copies of every document he'd ever signed in a locked box under the floorboard of his bedroom. He had died 14 months ago of a fever that came on fast and went faster, leaving Clara his only child, her mother having passed when Clara was 9, with the land the livestock. A manageable set of debts, and the belief instilled in her since childhood that a woman with her father's papers was a woman who could protect herself. She had not at that point met Charles Whitaker. Whitaker arrived in Willow Creek approximately 6 months after Thomas Bennett's death. He presented himself as a land developer with connections to Denver's banking community, a reputation for fair dealing, and a particular interest in helping families who had fallen into financial difficulty following the death of a primary earner. He was charming, he was patient, he dressed well and spoke better, and he told Clara that her father's debts, which were small but real, could be restructured under terms that would give her 5 years to repay, rather than 18 months, at a reduced interest rate with the land itself as collateral. It sounded like generosity. It was a mechanism. He had papers drawn up, Clara said. Her voice had gone tight and controlled the voice of someone recounting facts rather than feelings, because feelings would derail the telling. I signed them because I trusted him, because he was the only person who had offered to help without wanting something obvious in return. When did you realize he wanted something? About 4 months after I signed. The payments started coming back wrong. He'd send receipts showing I owed more than I'd paid. I'd go to dispute them, and there would be new terms I didn't remember agreeing to, buried in the original document in language I didn't understand. She paused. I'm not unintelligent, Mr. Brooks, Nathaniel Brooks. I'm not unintelligent, Mr. Brooks. But legal language written by men who intend to confuse you will confuse you regardless of your intelligence. Yes, Nathaniel agreed. It will. By the time I understood what he'd done, the debt had grown to a number I couldn't repay in 10 years. And Whitaker Charles. Whitaker came to me with a proposal. Her voice dropped. If I married him, the debt would be forgiven. The land would remain in the family name. My father's legacy would be protected. Nathaniel said nothing. I asked for a week to think about it, she continued. He gave me 3 days, and during those 3 days I went back through my father's papers, the ones in the locked box, the ones I'd only ever glanced at before, and I found something. What did you find? She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, the tightness in her voice had shifted into something else, something that sounded almost like fury underneath the exhaustion. I found proof that the debt itself was fabricated, she said. My father's original notes, his real payment records, copies of letters he'd sent to the county recorder's office about the river access on the northeast corner of the property, and a surveyor's report from 3 years ago that Whitaker had commissioned without my father's knowledge. Nathaniel's hands tightened slightly on the reins. He knew about the river. He's known about that river for 3 years, Clara said. He manufactured the entire situation, the help with the debt, the restructuring the terms I couldn't meet. All of it was designed to put me in a position where I had to either marry him or lose the land. And if I married him, the land would effectively become his. And if the land became his, the river access became his. And the river access is worth significant money, Nathaniel finished. If someone wanted to sell water rights to a mining operation. A pause. Yes. How did you know that? There are 3 silver mining companies currently operating within 20 miles of Willow Creek, he said. All of them are fighting over water access. A man who controlled a reliable river tributary on that stretch of the valley could name his price. Then you understand why he isn't going to simply let me go. I understand, Nathaniel said. Yes. They were quiet for a while after that. The mountain trail climbed and then leveled the horses, finding their rhythm, the afternoon shadows starting to stretch and thin. Nathaniel was thinking. I thought the way he did everything methodically, without rushing, following each thought to its logical end before beginning the next one. He thought about the woman sitting behind him. He thought about what she had described. He thought about the men at the checkpoint and the badge that had been pinned at the wrong angle. And he thought about how many men a person like Charles Whitaker could purchase if he had enough money and enough need. He thought about his father, who had been a man of very few principles, but had held those few very firmly. A man's character. His father had told him once when Nathaniel was 12, and watching a neighbor's farm burn, while 3 men stood across the road and did nothing, is revealed when helping someone costs him something. Nathaniel had been angry when his father said it because he was 12. And angry about the farm, and he'd said, then their character is revealed too, and it's not a good one. His father had smiled the slow, tired kind of smile of a man who had seen more disappointment than surprise and said, "That's exactly right, and that's exactly the point." Nathaniel had not thought about that conversation in years. He thought about it now. "Where were you planning to go?" he asked, "before you ended up in my carriage?" "I didn't have a plan that far advanced," she admitted. "You were just running." "I was running from something I understood very well," she said. "I had not yet gotten to the part where I was running toward something." He recognized that. He recognized it more than he expected to, more than he was comfortable admitting. "The carriage was stopped," she continued. "I saw it at the side of the loading dock. I saw the blankets in the back, and I thought—" She stopped. He could hear her trying to be practical about something that hadn't been practical at all. "I thought I could get far enough out of town to think. I didn't know it was yours. I didn't know anyone would be coming back to it." "If you'd known I was coming back, would you still have gotten in?" The pause before her answer was long enough to be honest. "No," she said. "Probably not." "Why not?" "Because asking for help requires trusting someone, and I had just spent 6 months learning what trusting someone costs." Nathaniel pulled the carriage to a slow stop at the fork in the road. To the left, back toward Willow Creek. To the right, his ranch. 14 miles of rough, quiet, empty country. No one came there uninvited. No one who didn't belong there would know where to look. He sat with the reins in his hands, and the question sitting between the two possible roads, and he did the math one more time. She had proof. She had her father's papers. She had something that could dismantle everything Charles Whitaker had built, but only if she was alive long enough, and free long enough, and supported enough to use it. She also had, he noted, gotten into a stranger's carriage, with no plan and no destination, because it was the only option she could find, and she had survived the checkpoint by remaining absolutely silent and perfectly still. And she had told him the entire situation in approximately 37 minutes, with clarity and precision, and only one moment where her voice had come close to breaking. He had made worse decisions about more uncertain things. He turned the horses right. "My ranch is about 14 miles from here," he said. "I have a guest room. It has a lock on the door. No one will bother you there." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" It was the question he had been expecting, and he had already decided to answer it honestly, rather than kindly. "Because you have evidence that can be used in a legal proceeding," he said. "Because the man who is after you is doing something that harms more people than just you. And because—" He stopped, started again. "Because you asked me not to let you be found, and I decided to honor that. And now I've told a man with a badge that your name is Clara Brooks, which means I'm already involved whether I intended to be or not. So I might as well be involved usefully." Another silence. Then, "That's either the most logical or the most reckless thing I've ever heard." "Those categories," Nathaniel said, "are not mutually exclusive." He heard something from behind him that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a laugh. It stopped before it fully formed, but it had been there. It was, he thought, a beginning. They reached the ranch as the last light was leaving the sky, that particular Colorado dusk that turned everything gold and then purple in less than 20 minutes, as though the land was in a hurry to put the day to rest. Marcus, his ranch hand, was closing the stable doors when the carriage came in. He was 61 years old, had worked for Nathaniel for 9 years, and had the particular quality of a man who had seen enough of life that very little surprised him. He looked at Clara, one boot-torn dress, the careful posture of someone trying not to show how exhausted they were, and then looked at Nathaniel. "Company," he said. "Temporarily," Nathaniel said. "She'll need the guest room prepared, and whatever food is left from supper." "There's stew," Marcus said. "Good." Marcus looked at Clara again. His expression was not unkind. "You need the doctor." "No," Clara said. "Thank you. I'm fine." Marcus nodded once, the specific nod of a man who understood the difference between someone saying they were fine and someone saying they didn't want to talk about it. "Stew's on the stove," he said, and went back to closing the stable doors. The guest room was simple: a bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the north field, and a hook and eye latch on the inside of the door that Clara located immediately upon entering, which told Nathaniel something about the last 14 months of her life without a single word being spoken. He set the lamp on the washstand and turned to leave. "Mr. Brooks." He stopped in the doorway. "I have my father's papers," she said. "In the bag." She was holding it against her chest, a small leather satchel, battered, the kind of bag that had been handled frequently and carefully and never left behind. "I know this isn't just a hiding situation anymore. I know Whitaker will look for me. I know this isn't over." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. I want to fix it," she said. "I don't want to just escape. I want there to be a real ending. The kind where he actually faces what he did. Not just to me. To my father." Her chin had come up slightly. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there at the checkpoint. Not fear, not exhaustion, but something harder and quieter and considerably more dangerous. "Can that happen?" Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "I know a lawyer in Denver," he said. "A good one. The kind who doesn't scare easily. But he'll need those papers, and he'll need time to build a case. And in the meantime, Whitaker will be looking for you, and he won't be quiet about it." "I'm not afraid of noise," Clara said. "I'm afraid of losing before I've had the chance to fight." "Those are different fears," Nathaniel said. "Yes," she agreed. "They are." He stood in the doorway for one more moment, and then he said the thing that surprised him slightly as he said it. Because it was true in a way he hadn't entirely planned for it to be. "You won't lose before you've had the chance to fight. I'll make sure of that." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not with the kind of visible relief that people show in stories. Just a small quiet, settling the way a person's shoulders drop when they have been braced for a long time and finally, for the first time in a long time, can afford to stop. "All right," she said. Nathaniel nodded and pulled the door closed. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark, listening to the sound of the hook and eye latch being secured from the inside. And then he went back to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed and thought about the fact that he had just told a stranger with one boot and a bag full of evidence and a powerful enemy that he would make sure she didn't lose. He thought about all the ways that could go wrong. He thought about the deputy's badge pinned at the wrong angle. I thought about the way she'd said, "I'm not afraid of noise. I'm afraid of losing before I've had the chance to fight." And then he lay down and he stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in 11 days, he felt something other than the particular quality of comfortable chosen silence he had built his life around. He felt, though he would not have used this word immediately, like something had shifted, like the ranch, which had been exactly full enough and exactly empty enough and exactly the right size for one man, and his deliberate solitude had changed its dimensions slightly, like it might, without his permission, have become larger. He closed his eyes. Outside, the Colorado night settled over the land, and inside the guest room, Clara Bennett sat on the edge of the bed with her father's papers in her lap, and she did not sleep, and she read every page one more time, because she was a woman who believed in knowing exactly what she was carrying before she asked anyone else to help her carry it. And in the stable, 2 horses settled into their stalls. And Marcus turned off the light in the bunkhouse. And Willow Creek, 14 miles away, continued to search. Clara did not sleep that night. She told herself it was caution, the reasonable, sensible kind that any person in her situation would exercise. She told herself it was the unfamiliar sounds of a strange house, the creak of wood settling in the cold, the distant sound of horses shifting in the stable. She told herself a great many things, and none of them were entirely untrue, and none of them were the whole truth either. The whole truth was simpler and harder to admit. She was afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would wake up and find that none of it had happened. That the carriage had been a dream. That the man on the driver's seat who had said, "She's my wife," to a deputy with a crooked badge had been something her exhausted mind invented. That she was still sitting in the small back room of the house that had been her father's, listening to Charles Whitaker's men outside the window, waiting for a wedding she had run out of time to refuse. So she didn't sleep. She read. She spread her father's papers across the bed in the order she had memorized over the past 3 days: the original deed, the payment ledgers, the surveyor's report. Whitaker had commissioned without permission the letters to the county recorder. the correspondence she had found tucked inside the back cover of the second ledger, written in a hand she didn't recognize until she read the signature at the bottom and understood that her father had known at the end what was being done to his land and had been trying quietly and without alarming her to stop it. Thomas Bennett had been trying to build a case of his own. He just hadn't survived long enough to finish it. Clara sat with that knowledge the way you sit with something that is both devastating and clarifying at the same time, the way grief and purpose can occupy the same moment without canceling each other out. Her father had not been naive. He had not been fooled. He had seen Whitaker for what he was and had begun to gather the evidence to prove it, and then a fever had come and gone and taken him before he could. She was finishing what he started. That was not a small thing. She folded the papers back into the satchel just before dawn, when the first gray light began to press under the gap at the bottom of the curtain. She sat with the bag in her lap and the house quiet around her, and thought about the man sleeping somewhere down the hallway. The man who had looked at her hiding in his carriage and made a decision in approximately 4 seconds that had changed the entire shape of what happened next. She thought about what he'd said in the doorway. "You won't lose before you've had the chance to fight." She had spent 6 months being told in various ways that her options were narrowing, that the debt was real, that the terms were what they were, that a woman alone with land she couldn't afford to keep was in a position that required someone else's help to survive. Every conversation with Whitaker, every meeting with his lawyers, every visit from the men he sent to remind her of the approaching deadline had been constructed to make her feel smaller, more cornered, more dependent. Nathaniel Brooks had said 12 words, and for the first time in 6 months, she had felt the walls move outward instead of in. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she noted it. Morning came with the smell of coffee. Clara had expected to be the first one awake. She had barely slept, and she was a woman who woke early regardless. But when she finally unlatched the hook and eye and opened the guest room door, the smell of fresh coffee was already moving through the hallway, which meant someone had been up before her. She followed it to the kitchen. Nathaniel was standing at the stove with his back to the door, pouring coffee into 2 cups, with the efficient, unself-conscious movements of a man who had done this exact action alone every morning for years. He didn't turn around when she entered, but he pushed the second cup to the far edge of the stove without being asked. "Sit down," he said. "There's bread from yesterday and bacon when I get to it." Clara sat. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The warmth spread through her palms and up her wrists, and she realized she had been cold for so long. Not just last night, but for months. The kind of cold that comes from sustained fear, that the sensation of something warm and ordinary was almost startling. "How did you sleep?" he asked, still not turning around. "I didn't particularly. I know." He said it simply without judgment. "I heard you moving around until about 3 in the morning." She felt a flash of embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I wasn't sleeping either." He turned then, bringing the pan to the table, and looked at her directly in the full morning light for the first time. "I was thinking about the lawyer. The one in Denver you mentioned. His name is Robert Calloway. He practiced land law in St. Louis for 12 years before he moved west. He's handled 3 cases of fraudulent debt restructuring in the last 2 years alone, one of which went to federal court." Nathaniel set the pan down and sat across from her. He's also the kind of man who does not like being on the losing side of an argument. Clara looked at him. "You know him well." "Well enough to know he'll take this case if the evidence is what you say it is." "The evidence is what I say it is." There was no defensiveness in her voice, just certainty, the flat kind that comes from having read the same documents 40 times until you know every word of them. "Better, actually. My father had started annotating the original contracts. There are notes in his handwriting on the margins of the debt restructuring agreement that show exactly where the language was altered from what he was verbally told. It's not just that Whitaker committed fraud. It's documented fraud in my father's own hand with dates." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That changes the timeline." "What do you mean?" "I mean that if the evidence is that specific, Calloway won't need 6 months to build a case. He might need 6 weeks. He paused. "Which also means Whitaker's people will be moving faster than I assumed last night." Something tightened in Clara's chest. What do you mean moving faster? I mean that a man who has as much at stake as Whitaker doesn't stop looking when the first search comes up empty. He regroups. Nathaniel wrapped his hands around his own cup. He'll start asking questions about who was leaving town around the time you disappeared. He'll remember that there were carriages at the loading dock that weren't fully searched. Eventually, someone will remember mine. Clara absorbed this. How long do we have? I don't know. A few days, maybe more, maybe less. He looked at her steadily. I want to send a rider to Denver today. Get a message to Calloway before Whitaker has a chance to get ahead of us. And in the meantime, you stay here. You don't go near town, and you don't open the door to anyone you don't recognize. He said this last part without dramatic emphasis, which somehow made it land harder. I need to know you'll follow those terms. I'm not a person who needs to be managed, Mr. Brooks. I know that, he said, and his voice was so matter-of-fact that it stopped her prepared response before it fully formed. I'm not trying to manage you. I'm telling you what I need from you so that I can do what I said I'd do. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment across the table. All right, she said. Those terms are acceptable. He nodded once, and they ate breakfast in silence, and it was not the uncomfortable kind. Marcus left for Denver before 8 o'clock, carrying a sealed letter in his coat pocket and strict instructions to take the northern route to avoid the Willow Creek road. He was a man of few words and considerable judgment, and he asked no questions except the practical ones. How soon, which road, and did Nathaniel need him back by a specific date? As soon as Calloway sends a reply, Nathaniel said. Marcus nodded, mounted, and rode north without further comment. Clara watched him go from the kitchen window. Does he know what the letter says? He knows enough. Is he trustworthy? He's the only person outside this house who knows you're here, Nathaniel said. If he weren't trustworthy, we'd already have a problem. She accepted this. She was learning in small increments the particular language Nathaniel Brooks used, spare precise with the kind of confidence that didn't require extra words to prop it up. He said things once, he meant them. It was a different kind of speaking than she was used to. Whitaker had been a man of extraordinary verbal abundance. Every conversation with him had been layered piled high with pleasantries and reassurances and carefully constructed qualifications that meant something different from what they appeared to mean. Listening to him had required constant translation, the exhausting process of trying to identify what he was actually saying beneath what he appeared to be saying. Nathaniel said what he meant. She hadn't realized until she experienced the contrast how deeply tiring the alternative had been. The first 3 days passed in a careful rhythm. Clara was not the kind of woman who could remain idle for long. This had been true her entire life, and the events of the past months had sharpened rather than dulled the tendency. On the first morning, she asked Nathaniel where he kept his mending, and he pointed her toward a basket in the corner of the main room that contained approximately 4 months' worth of deferred clothing repair. She worked through half of it by afternoon. On the second day, she reorganized the supply inventory in the main storage room, which Marcus had apparently been adding to, without removing from, in a system that had long since ceased to qualify as a system. She found 2 pounds of coffee that had been buried behind a sack of flour, 3 lanterns that needed new wicks, and a set of harness straps that had been repaired with the wrong kind of thread and would fail under any real strain. She left a note on the work table explaining the harness straps. Nathaniel found the note that evening. He read it, looked up at her, and said, "How do you know about harness straps?" "My father's farm didn't run itself," she said. "I know about most things that are necessary." He looked at the note again. Then he nodded, set it down, and went to find the right thread. On the third morning, she found an injured hawk in the yard, a red tail, one wing held low and wrong turning in the desperate, exhausted circles of an animal that had been fighting gravity longer than its body could sustain. She caught it without thinking, wrapped it in her apron, and was sitting at the kitchen table examining the wing with careful, methodical hands when Nathaniel came in. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the hawk. Then he looked at her. "I've set a wing before," she said without looking up. "My father's farm was near a nesting ridge. We did it fairly often." "I know," Nathaniel said quietly. "I was just—" He stopped. She looked up then. Something had moved across his face. Something unguarded, brief, gone almost immediately. But she caught the tail end of it. It wasn't surprise. It was something more complicated than that. "I'll get the splinting materials," he said, and turned around. She watched him leave and thought about the expression she'd seen and decided not to ask about it. Not yet. Some things needed time to find their own words. On the fourth day, Charles Whitaker's man arrived. He came on horseback in the early afternoon, a single rider on a gray horse, and he stopped at the gate rather than riding in, which was either caution or deliberate restraint, the kind designed to look less threatening than it was. Clara was in the storage room when she heard the hoofbeats. She went still immediately the way Nathaniel had told her to. From where she stood, she could hear the conversation in the yard. "Afternoon." The man's voice was even pleasant, the voice of someone trained to make unwelcome visits sound routine. "I'm looking for a Nathaniel Brooks. This his property?" "Depends who's asking." That was Nathaniel. He must have come from the stable. "Name's Aldridge. I'm working on behalf of Mr. Charles Whitaker, out of Willow Creek. Mr. Whitaker is looking for a young woman who may have passed through this area a few days ago. He's very concerned for her welfare." A pause. "Is he?" Nathaniel said. "She ran away from home under some distress." Aldridge continued. "Mr. Whitaker was supposed to marry her just that afternoon. He's worried she may have you understand. A woman alone in some emotional state. He just wants to know she's safe." Clara pressed herself against the wall of the storage room and did not breathe. "I haven't seen any young women in distress," Nathaniel said. His voice was exactly the same tone it always was. Flat, careful, carrying nothing extra. "This is a working ranch. We don't see much foot traffic." The deputy in town mentioned a carriage. Said a man named Brooks came through the checkpoint the afternoon she disappeared. Had his wife with him. Another pause. Longer this time. "My wife and I came through Willow Creek for supplies," Nathaniel said. "She was with me. That's not unusual." "Would you mind if I spoke with her?" "She's resting," Nathaniel said. "She's been under the weather. I'd prefer not to disturb her." Clara heard the pause on the other side of that. "Mr. Whitaker is prepared to offer a substantial reward," Aldridge said. The pleasantness had thinned slightly. "To anyone who might have information about the young woman's whereabouts." "I appreciate that," Nathaniel said. "But as I said, I haven't seen her." Another silence. Longer. The kind that two men stand in when one of them is deciding whether he believes the other, and the other is deciding whether it matters. "If you do happen to hear anything," Aldridge said finally, "Mr. Whitaker would consider it a personal favor to be informed." "I'll keep that in mind." The hoofbeats retreated. Clara stayed against the wall until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she walked to the kitchen, sat down, and found that her hands were shaking. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular aftermath of sustained control, the way a person shakes after they have held something very tightly for a very long time. Nathaniel came through the back door 2 minutes later. He looked at her hands. He didn't say anything about the shaking. "That was faster than I expected," he said. "He described me as a woman who ran away in emotional distress," Clara said. "Someone who needed to be found for her own safety." "Yes. He's already built the narrative." Her voice was steady again. She was steadying it deliberately. "Before there's any legal proceeding, before there's any public conversation about what actually happened, he's already established that I'm the one who behaved irrationally, that he's the concerned party." Nathaniel sat across from her. "Yes, he's done this before." She looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Whitaker's land dealings in this area go back further than your father's property." Something had shifted in Nathaniel's voice, a careful, deliberate quality, like a man placing a heavy object down rather than dropping it. 3 years ago, a family named Okafor lost 40 acres under circumstances that sounded very similar to what you described. Debt restructuring, a contract with altered terms, a deadline that moved faster than it should have. Clara stared at him. "What happened to them?" "They left. They had 4 children and no resources to fight, and they took the offer Whitaker made to them and moved east." Nathaniel's jaw set. "I know this because I tried to help them. I offered to hold their debt for a year, give them time to find a lawyer. The man Henry Okafor told me, Whitaker had already told him that if anyone helped them fight the claim, Whitaker would make sure the county court found additional irregularities in the original deed. Additional debts. It would take years and everything they had to fight it, and they probably still wouldn't win. Clara was very quiet. He threatened a family, she said. He threatened a family through the legal system, Nathaniel said, which is considerably more effective and considerably harder to fight than a direct threat. He looked at her directly. That's why the evidence you're carrying matters as much as it does. It's not just about your case. If Calloway can prove a pattern, then it changes everything, Clara finished. For the Okafors, for anyone else he's done this to, and there will be others. He said this flatly without theatrical anger, but underneath the flatness was something that had clearly been sitting there for 3 years. Something patient and cold, and very determined. There will always be others until someone stops him. Clara looked at the satchel sitting on the kitchen counter where she'd left it that morning. She thought about her father writing notes in the margins of a fraudulent contract in the months before he died, knowing what was coming, trying to build something that would outlast him. She thought about the Okafors and their 4 children and the 40 acres and the threat that had been dressed up in legal language so that it looked like procedure rather than violence. She looked at Nathaniel. Then we don't just build a case for my land, she said. We build a case that ends it. Nathaniel held her gaze for a long moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, not doubt, not hesitation. Something more careful than that. Something that understood exactly what she was proposing and was measuring its weight. That's a larger fight, he said. I know. It will take longer, and it will make Whitaker more aggressive, not less, when he understands the scope of what we're doing. I know that too. And you're prepared for that. Clara straightened in her chair. The shaking in her hands had stopped. Mr. Brooks, I spent 6 months watching a man dismantle everything my father built piece by piece, using the law as a weapon against people who couldn't afford to fight back. I have sat in rooms with his lawyers and smiled and said, "Yes, sir," and tried to be reasonable and cooperative because I thought that was how you survived. She paused. I'm done surviving. I want to win. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind that follows a declaration, not a question, not a request, but a statement of direction. Nathaniel said, "All right." And that was all he said, and it was enough. The reply from Robert Calloway arrived on the 6th day. Marcus rode in at midday, dusty and tired and moving with the purposeful exhaustion of a man who had covered significant ground quickly and was not complaining about it. He handed the sealed letter to Nathaniel and went directly to the well. Nathaniel read it at the kitchen table with Clara sitting across from him. She watched his face as he read, because she had learned in 6 days that Nathaniel's face was not expressive in the ordinary way. He didn't raise his eyebrows, or set his jaw, or let the progression of an emotion play out visibly. What he did instead was go through a series of very slight adjustments, a microscopic stillness, when something surprised him, a fractional shift in how he was holding his breath, when something concerned him, a barely perceptible release when something satisfied him. She had been watching him for 6 days. She could read the adjustments. He went still at the 2nd paragraph. Then came the fractional shift. Then at the end, the release. He set the letter down and pushed it across the table to her. She read it. Robert Calloway, attorney at law, wrote in the compact, direct language of a man who charged by the hour and saw no reason to waste anyone's time, including his own. He confirmed receipt of Nathaniel's communication. He confirmed his familiarity with Charles Whitaker's name. It appeared he wrote in connection with 2 other land disputes in the territory that he had been following with professional interest. He confirmed that if the evidence was as described, there was a viable case under both territorial land law and federal fraud statute. And then he wrote the sentence that Clara had to read twice to be certain she had understood it correctly. Given the scope of what you're describing, I believe this matter warrants federal attention rather than territorial court. I have a contact in the Land Fraud Division of the U.S. Marshal's Office who has been building a file on activity in the Willow Creek area for approximately 8 months. Your client's evidence may be exactly what closes that file. Clara set the letter down. She looked at Nathaniel. The federal marshals, she said, have already been watching him, Nathaniel confirmed. Which means we're not starting from nothing. We're adding to something that already exists. Whitaker doesn't know this. No. He thinks this is a local dispute, a woman with some papers and a sympathetic rancher. Yes. She sat with this for a long moment, turning it over, examining it from all the angles her father had taught her to examine things from before she decided what to do with them. This changes the risk calculation, she said finally. How? It means that if Whitaker moves against us legally, physically, anyway, he's not just threatening a private citizen on private property. He's interfering with a federal investigation. She looked up. He doesn't know he's already caught in something larger than himself. Nathaniel said nothing. He was watching her think, and he was doing it with the particular quality of attention she had noticed in him from the first morning. Not impatient, not trying to anticipate or redirect, simply present. Waiting for where she was going. We need to get me to Denver, she said. And we need to do it before he figures out that I'm not just hiding. Before he figures out that I'm building something. I was going to suggest the same thing, Nathaniel said. There's a stage road that runs north of the Whitaker property, avoids Willow Creek entirely. It's a longer trip, but considerably safer. When? He looked at her directly. How much longer do you need with the papers? I've been ready since the first night. Something moved across his face, that unguarded thing she'd seen when she was tending the hawk brief, and complicated and not quite identifiable. He looked away before she could pin it down. Then we leave day after tomorrow, he said. I'll make the arrangements. Clara nodded. She picked up Calloway's letter and folded it carefully and placed it in the satchel next to her father's documents. The bag was getting heavier. Not with paper, but with what the paper meant: the months of her father's careful work. The 6 months of her own fear and survival. The Okafor's 40 acres. The families she hadn't met yet, who had been through the same thing, or were still in the middle of it. She carried all of that. Every single page of it. And for the first time since her father died, she didn't feel like the weight was going to break her. She felt like it was something she was strong enough to carry all the way to where it needed to go. That evening after supper, Nathaniel told her about his wife. He didn't plan to. She asked him in the quiet, particular way she had of asking things not directly, but by creating a space where a direct answer became possible. Why there was a woman's rocking chair on the porch that no one seemed to use. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, her name was Anna. She died 4 years ago. Fever. Same thing that took your father, though it happened faster. He paused. She liked to sit on the porch in the evenings. Said the ranch looked different at dusk than at any other time of day. I'm sorry, Clara said. And she meant it the way she meant everything without performance. She would have liked you, Nathaniel said. And then he seemed surprised he'd said it in the small, quick way he had of registering things he hadn't planned on. He looked down at his coffee. Clara didn't make it easier for him, or harder. She just sat with the words he'd said and let them exist. She was practical, he said finally. And she didn't waste time on things that couldn't be changed. She had very little patience for people who convinced themselves they were helpless. He looked up briefly. I mean that as a compliment. I took it as one, Clara said. They sat in silence after that. The fire had burned low, and neither of them moved to add wood, and the room grew slowly cooler, and neither of them seemed to particularly mind. Outside, the Colorado night was doing what it always did, going from cold to colder in the particular way of high country evenings, the stars coming in hard and bright and very close. Inside, something that had no clean name was settling between two people who were very careful about what they let themselves feel and were beginning, without either of them having said so, to fail at that carefulness in small specific ways. Clara was the first one to stand. I should sleep, she said. If we're leaving day after tomorrow, I should actually sleep. Yes. Nathaniel agreed. She picked up the satchel from the table. At the doorway she paused. Mr. Brooks. He looked up. Thank you, she said. Not for tonight specifically, for all of it. He held her gaze for a moment. You'd have found another way. Maybe, she said, but this one is considerably better. She went down the hallway. He heard the hook and eye latch engage. He sat at the table for another hour after she left alone with the low fire and the cooling coffee and the particular sensation of a house that had shifted in its dimensions and was still quietly refusing to shift back. He didn't fight it. He had learned in the years since Anna that fighting the things you couldn't control was the single fastest way to exhaust yourself into uselessness. He just sat with it. And outside. Willow Creek was 14 miles away, and Charles Whitaker was somewhere inside it, rearranging his plans for a woman he had catastrophically underestimated. And the satchel on the kitchen counter was gone, because Clara had taken it with her. Because she never left it behind. Because she knew exactly what she was carrying. They left before sunrise. Not because Nathaniel had told her to be ready early, he hadn't needed to. Clara was already in this kitchen when he came through at 4:30, the satchel over her shoulder, her hair pinned back neatly, wearing a coat Marcus had found in the storage room that was 3 sizes too large, and which she wore with the matter-of-fact practicality of a woman who had stopped caring about appearances sometime around the 3rd day of running for her life. She had made coffee. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the 2 cups on the table, and something in his expression did the thing she had started to recognize, that small, unguarded adjustment brief as a breath gone before it could be named. He sat down and drank the coffee without comment. "Marcus is staying," she asked. "He'll watch the ranch, and watch for anyone who comes asking questions." Nathaniel wrapped both hands around the cup. "If Aldridge comes back, Marcus will tell him I've gone to Pueblo for cattle business. That's routine enough to be believable. And if they push harder than believable. Marcus has handled harder situations than a man with a polite face and a reward offer." He looked at her steadily. "I trust him." Clara nodded. She had learned in 8 days to calibrate her trust by his. Not blindly, she had done blind trust once, and it had cost her nearly everything, but carefully using his judgments as a data point alongside her own. So far, his judgments had been accurate. "How long is the drive to Denver?" 2 days if we keep pace. We'll stop overnight at a station house I know near Castle Rock. The owner is a woman named Ruth Hadley. She doesn't ask questions about her guests. Does she know you? She knows I'm not the kind of man who brings trouble to her door. He finished the coffee and stood. That's generally enough for Ruth. They were on the road before the sky had fully decided what color it intended to be. For the first hour, they rode in the kind of silence that had become over 8 days less about not knowing what to say, and more about not needing to fill the air. Clara sat on the carriage seat beside him, not in the back this time, not hidden under blankets, but upright and in plain view, and watched the country open up ahead of them and thought about her father. She thought about him often in the mornings. It had been his favorite time of day, the hour before full light, when everything was still undecided, when the farm existed in a state of becoming rather than being. He used to say that mornings were the only honest part of the day, because nothing had been ruined yet. She wondered what he would have made of Nathaniel Brooks. She thought he would have liked him. Her father had had a talent for recognizing men who meant what they said, and an equally precise talent for recognizing men who didn't. It had made him excellent at negotiation and terrible at accepting that some people were simply beyond the reach of good faith. That had been his undoing in the end. He had extended good faith to the wrong person. She was not going to make that mistake, but she was also, she realized, starting to understand the difference between a closed heart and a careful one. Her father's had been open. Whitaker's people had walked right through it. Since then, she had kept hers locked double-latched, no visitors. Nathaniel's was neither open nor locked. It was present, watchful, capable of letting things in if they proved worth letting in. She recognized the mechanism. She was beginning to recognize it because she was starting to see it operating in herself. "Tell me about the Okafors," she said. He glanced at her. "What about them?" "Everything. What the land looked like, what the family was like, what happened in the end." She kept her eyes forward. "If I'm going to build a case that ends this for everyone, I need to understand everyone it happened to, not just myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking. Henry Okafor had come to Colorado from Georgia 12 years earlier with his wife Josephine, their eldest daughter, and $40. Over the following decade, they had built a farm that produced wheat, kept 20 head of cattle, and employed 2 additional hands in good years. The northeast corner of their property butted up against a natural spring smaller than the tributary on Clara's father's land, but reliable, and in drought years invaluable. Whitaker had approached them in the same season he approached the Bennett's neighbor 2 years later after a difficult winter, when the cash reserves were low, and the debt on the property's original purchase had come due in an inconvenient way. He had offered restructuring. He had been charming. He had been patient. Henry had signed. Within 5 months, the terms had shifted. Within 8 months, the debt had grown to something unmanageable. Within 10 months, Whitaker had made his proposal: sell the northeast corner, just the spring, and the rest of the debt would be forgiven. Henry had refused. 2 weeks after the refusal, the county tax assessor sent a notice of unpaid taxes on a parcel Henry had never known. He owed taxes on a clerical dispute that should have taken 2 weeks to resolve, and instead took 4 months, during which Henry's access to the spring was legally clouded by the ongoing dispute, during which the cattle couldn't be watered adequately, during which 3 animals died, and the farm's operating margin collapsed. Josephine had taken the children to stay with her sister in Kansas City. Henry had fought alone for 6 more weeks before accepting Whitaker's reduced final offer. The spring at a price that covered the debt, but nothing more, leaving him the land, but not the water that made the land worth anything. He had left Colorado 2 months later. Clara listened to all of this without interrupting. When Nathaniel finished, she said, "He manufactured the tax dispute." "I believe so, but belief isn't proof." "The timing is too precise to be coincidence." "Yes, but Whitaker understands that timing by itself isn't admissible. Unless there's a pattern." She was thinking out loud, following the thread. If Callaway can show a county tax assessor who consistently opens disputes on properties Whitaker has targeted within weeks of those property owners refusing his offers, then the timing becomes evidence, Nathaniel said. "Yes. Is the same assessor still in the position?" He looked at her. The look lasted slightly longer than a simple yes or no required. "Yes." "Then that's a piece of it." She turned to him fully. "Do you have any contact with the Okafors? Any way to reach Henry?" "Josephine has a sister in Kansas City. I have the address from a letter Henry sent me 2 years ago." He paused. "I kept it." "Why?" Another pause. "Because I always thought someone would eventually do what you're doing now. I just didn't know who." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You've been waiting for this," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've been hoping for it," he said. "Those are different things." They drove in silence for a while after that, but it was the charged kind, the kind that follows a revelation, when 2 people are separately processing what has just been said and what it implies, and whether they are going to acknowledge all of it, or just the parts that are easy. Clara chose to acknowledge all of it. "You helped them," she said. "The Okafors. You offered to hold their debt, and Whitaker threatened them to make them refuse your help." "Yes, so he already considers you an obstacle." Nathaniel's jaw set slightly. "He considers me an irritant, a neighbor with inconvenient principles, someone to rout around." "He sent Aldridge here because he already suspected you." "He sent Aldridge here because I was at the checkpoint," Nathaniel said. "Whether he suspected me specifically before that I don't know. He does now." The weight of this settled between them. "I've put you in this," Clara said. And her voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but more direct, more honest. The voice she used when she was saying something she had thought carefully about before saying. "By getting into your carriage, I've made you a target." "You didn't make me anything," Nathaniel said. "I made a choice." "That doesn't mean the consequences fall only on you." "No, it means I knew there might be consequences, and I chose anyway." He kept his eyes on the road. "That's what choices are." She looked at his profile, the set of his jaw, the particular quality of stillness in his hands on the reins, not tense, just steady. The way a man is steady when he has thought a thing through completely. "Why?" she asked. "And I don't mean the practical reason you gave me in the carriage. I mean the real one." The silence before he answered was the longest one yet. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. "Because I watched what happened to the Okafors," he said finally. "And I didn't do enough. I offered money, and when he refused, I stepped back because it was his decision to make, and I told myself I had respected his autonomy and his choices." His voice was flat, controlled. The particular control of a man who has had this conversation with himself many times. "And then they left. And Whitaker got the spring. And I went back to my ranch and my silence and my very firm belief that other people's business was their own." He stopped. "And then?" Clara asked quietly. "And then you were in my carriage," he said. "And you looked at me with the same fear I had seen in Henry Okafor's eyes the last time I saw him. And I thought not again. Not if I can stop it." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate, so she said nothing, and she let the words stand as they were. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat. Ruth Hadley's station house was still a good 6 hours ahead, and the road had begun climbing as they moved toward higher country. The horses needed water and a break from the grade. They sat on opposite sides of the carriage with bread and dried beef and the of two people engaged in a task together. Clara had the satchel in her lap, and she was going through the papers one more time, not because she didn't know them, but because the act of reviewing them steadied her the way some people steady themselves by counting or praying. Nathaniel watched her work. He watched the way her eyes moved across the pages, not reading the way a person reads for information, but reading the way a person reads when they have committed something to memory and are confirming it is still there. He watched how she organized the documents without looking at them, her hands knowing the order. He watched the small line that formed between her brows when she reached the passage that still made her angry. He had learned to recognize it 3 days into their mornings at the kitchen table and the way it released when she moved past it. He thought about Anna. He didn't do this often, not deliberately, not with the intention of comparison. It was less a choice and more a reflex, the way any significant presence triggers the memory of other significant presences. The way the mind reaches for context when the heart is operating outside its established patterns. Anna had been steady, practical, unsentimental in ways that had complemented his own unsentimental nature. They had been in the best sense well-matched two people who understood the same world and wanted the same things from it, and were content most of the time to build those things quietly. Clara was not the same. She was not unsentimental. She had sentiments, deep, complicated, carefully controlled ones that she didn't perform, but that you could occasionally see through the gaps in the control, the way you can see fire through the slats of a lantern. She was building something always, even when she was sitting still. Her mind was never at rest. She was also, he had noticed, frequently right, not in the way people are right when they're lucky, but in the way people are right when they've done the work of thinking a thing through completely before they speak it. She had been right about the harness straps, right about the document annotation strategy she'd suggested for organizing the papers before the Denver meeting, right about Aldridge's visit, meaning Whitaker was moving faster than they'd assumed. He was thinking about this when Clara looked up and caught him watching her. He looked away. "Sorry," he said. "You don't have to apologize for looking," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact. "I look at you too when you're not watching." He turned back to her. She was already looking at the papers again, as though she'd said something perfectly ordinary. But the tips of her ears had gone slightly pink, which she couldn't control and probably wasn't aware of. Nathaniel looked back at the road and said nothing, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 4 years, do something he hadn't expected it to do. He filed it carefully. Somewhere he could find it later when there was time to examine it properly. They were 2 hours from Ruth Hadley's station house when the rider appeared behind them. Nathaniel saw him first, a single horse on the road behind them, moving fast, closing the distance with the focused urgency of someone with a specific destination. He didn't say anything to Clara immediately. He watched the rider in his peripheral attention for a full minute, clocking the pace, the direction, the way the horse was being pushed. "Don't turn around," he said. Clara went very still. "Rider 1, coming fast." He kept his voice even. "Maybe nothing. Stage roads have traffic. But But he's been behind us for the last 3 miles, and he's been closing since the first one. Clara's hand moved to the satchel. He saw the movement and understood it. She was confirming by touch that it was still there. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Keep driving, normal pace. If he's going to make a move, he'll make it when he's alongside us." Nathaniel reached under the carriage seat and, without any visible alteration in his posture, freed the rifle he kept secured there. He laid it across his knees under the lap blanket. "Whatever happens, don't leave the seat." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The rider came up alongside them 2 minutes later. How was young early 20s, trail dusty, riding a horse that had been pushed hard. He had the slightly chaotic look of someone who had been sent in a hurry, rather than sent with a plan, which was either reassuring or more alarming, depending on which direction you turned it. "Brooks," he called out. Nathaniel did not stop the carriage. He slowed it marginally and looked at the rider with the expression of a man who is waiting to understand the situation before he reacts to it. "That's my name," he said. "Message for you, from Marcus." The rider reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "He said to ride hard, said you'd want it before you got to the station house." Nathaniel looked at the envelope. He looked at the rider. "Ride up closer," he said. The rider pulled his horse alongside the carriage. Nathaniel took the envelope without stopping, completely keeping the horses moving at a walk. He turned it over. The seal was intact, a small wax impression that he and Marcus had agreed upon before leaving, a precaution he had thought overly cautious at the time and was now grateful for. "Who gave you this?" "Old man at the Brooks Ranch. Said it was urgent. Paid me $2 to ride it out." "Did anyone follow you out of the ranch?" The young man blinked. The question had surprised him, which meant probably not. "Not that I saw." "All right." Nathaniel handed him a coin. "Get off the main road and go back the long way, through the creek valley." The rider looked confused, but he took the coin and turned his horse without argument. Nathaniel opened the letter. Marcus's handwriting was large and uneven, the handwriting of a man who wrote rarely but carefully when he did. The message was short. "Whitaker in person. Came this morning with 4 men and a county writ. Claims right to search property for stolen documents. I said you'd taken the papers to Pueblo for cattle business. He didn't believe me, but couldn't prove different. Left 1 man watching the south road. There's a 2nd man I didn't see until he was already gone. Think he rode north. Be careful. He knows more than Aldridge found out." Nathaniel read it once, then handed it to Clara. She read it faster than he had. When she looked up, her face was controlled, but underneath the control was something that had sharpened considerably. "He used a county writ," she said, "to search your property." "Yes." "That means he has the county court behind him, or he's convinced someone there that he does. Or both. A writ to search for stolen documents." She turned the phrase over, and he could see her working it. "He's calling my father's papers stolen. He's framing this as he's inverting it. He's making himself the victim of the theft." "It establishes a narrative," Nathaniel said, "before any proceeding. Just like the story about you running away in emotional distress. He's building the legal ground before the fight starts." Clara's jaw set. "He's better at this than I gave him credit for. He's had 3 years of practice. And he had advance warning from Aldridge that the papers were on your property." She was thinking faster now. He could tell the way her speech slightly accelerated when she was following a thread somewhere important. "Which means he doesn't know we're heading to Denver. He thinks we're contained. He thinks the papers are still at the ranch." "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Then we have a window." "A narrow one. Then we don't stop at the station house," she said. "We drive through the night." Nathaniel held her gaze. He ran the calculation, the horses, the road conditions, the risk of night travel in mountain country against the risk of stopping somewhere Whitaker might be able to reach before morning. "Ruth Hadley's is 40 minutes off the main road," he said. "If we stop only to change horses and not to sleep." "Yes," Clara said immediately. "That. It'll be a hard ride. Mr. Brooks." Her voice was steady and direct. "I slept 1 hour in the past 2 days before I ended up in your carriage. I think I can manage a hard ride." He almost smiled. He flicked the reins, and the horses picked up their pace. Ruth Hadley was a woman of approximately 60, who had the quality of someone who had made peace with every difficult thing life had sent her, and consequently had no patience whatsoever for drama. She met them at the stable door at 9 in the evening with a lantern and the expression of a woman who had been expecting them 3 hours earlier. "You're late," she said to Nathaniel. "Change of plan," he said. "We need fresh horses and we can't stay." Ruth looked at Clara with the direct assessing gaze of a woman taking inventory. "You're the one Whitaker is looking for," she said. Clara went very still. Nathaniel started to speak. "Don't," Ruth said, not unkindly. "I know because 2 men came through here 4 hours ago asking about a carriage heading north. Gave a description." She looked at Clara. "I told them I hadn't seen anyone matching it, which was true at the time." She paused. "It's less true now," Clara said. "Why didn't you send them after us?" Ruth gave her a look that suggested the question was almost too simple to answer. "Because men who ride ahead of the law to ask questions at private stations are not men I care to assist." She turned toward the stable. "I'll have fresh horses in 20 minutes. There's coffee inside if you can drink it fast." Clara looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at her. "Don't ask me to explain, Ruth," he said. "She operates on principles I've never fully mapped." "I like her," Clara said. "Everyone does," Nathaniel said. "She finds it exhausting." They were back on the road within the hour. The night was clear and cold, and absolutely full of stars, the kind of Colorado sky that seemed too large to be real. Too many stars too close. The band of the Milky Way so bright it cast a faint shadow. Clara sat beside Nathaniel on the carriage seat, with the lap blanket pulled tight and the satchel between her feet, where she could feel it against her ankles. She was tired. She would not have admitted this under anything short of extreme duress, but she was tired in a way that had gone past the ordinary kind and into the territory of bone deep. The kind of tired that a person gets when they have been running on determination and necessity for months, and the determination has not faded, but the body is beginning to register its own opinion. Nathaniel must have noticed, because 20 minutes into the drive, he said without any particular inflection, "You can sleep. I'll keep us on the road." "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. You can still sleep." She looked at him. "I'm not going to let anything happen to those papers," he said. "Or to you. You can put that down for a few hours." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark with the stars overhead, and the road ahead, and the cold settling into everything that wasn't moving. And then, because she was tired, and because she believed him, and because she had learned in 10 days the difference between trust given carelessly and trust given after careful evaluation, she leaned slightly to the left, found the solid weight of his shoulder, and let her eyes close. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just kept the horses steady and the road straight and his shoulder exactly where it was, and she slept for 3 hours, which was the most she had slept in one stretch since the week before her father died. When she woke, they were descending toward the lower country, and the first gray edge of dawn was touching the horizon to the east, and Nathaniel was still driving, and the satchel was still between her feet, and nothing had been lost or taken or undone while she was sleeping. She sat up straight. "How far?" she asked. 3 hours, he said. "Maybe less." She reached into the satchel and found her father's ledger by touch. She held it in her lap, her thumb along the spine. "He's going to fight this in court," she said. "Even when we present the evidence. Even when Calloway makes the case. He's going to fight it because men like him always believe they can outlast anyone who opposes them." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Then we have to make sure the evidence is so complete that fighting is pointless." She looked straight ahead at the road. "I want to make sure that when this ends, it ends completely. Not a settlement, not a compromise, a full reckoning." "That's what Calloway is good at," Nathaniel said. "And the federal marshal's office. If what Calloway said is accurate, if they've been building a file for 8 months, then your papers are the last piece they need." He looked at her. "You're not just a plaintiff, Clara. You're a witness, the most important one they have." She absorbed the shift from her name to her role to the full weight of what Denver actually meant. And then something else registered. He had called her Clara, not Miss Bennett. Not the careful professional formality he had maintained through the first week, the respectful distance he had built and maintained like a fence line. Just Clara. She didn't say anything about it, but she noted it the way she noted everything carefully, without fuss, storing it somewhere she could return to when the time was right. "Then we make sure I testify well," she said. "You'll testify perfectly," Nathaniel said. "You always know exactly what you want to say." She looked at him. There was something in the way he'd said it. Not flattery, not reassurance, but the simple observation of a man who had been paying attention. "You've been watching me," she said. "Yes," he said, simply, without apology. She turned back to the road. "All right," she said, and the horses carried them toward Denver as the dawn came in wide and gold and absolutely certain of itself, the way Colorado mornings were, without hesitation, without apology, as though the day had already decided exactly what it intended to be and was simply arriving on schedule. And in the satchel between Clara's feet, her father's papers waited with the quiet patience of truth that has been kept long enough and is finally at last almost exactly where it needs to be. Robert Calloway's office was on the second floor of a building on Larimer Street, and it smelled like old paper and tobacco, and the particular kind of concentrated ambition that accumulates in a space where serious work has been done for a long time. Calloway himself was 63 years old, thin in the way of men who forget to eat when they are working, with sharp gray eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by urgency and started being impressed only by evidence. He looked at Clara's satchel the way a doctor looks at a patient, with careful professional attention, stripped of everything personal. "Put it on the table," he said. Clara set the satchel down and opened it and began laying the documents out in the order she had organized them, which was not chronological but argumentative. The fraudulent contract first, then the original payment records that contradicted it, then her father's annotated margins, then the surveyor's report, then the correspondence. Calloway picked up the first document and began reading. He did not speak for 11 minutes. Nathaniel stood near the window. Clara stood near the table. Neither of them sat because sitting felt wrong. Too comfortable, too settled for a moment that was still in the process of becoming what it was going to be. When Calloway set the last document down, he took his spectacles off and cleaned them with his handkerchief, which Clara had already identified as something he did when he was thinking, rather than when the lenses were actually dirty. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Yes. Your father was a more sophisticated legal thinker than most men I've encountered with formal training." He set the spectacles back on. "These annotations are not simply observations. They're a systematic deconstruction of how the fraud was executed, clause by clause. He knew exactly what had been done to him." Clara's throat tightened. She kept her voice even. "He had several months after he realized what Whitaker was doing. He used them carefully." "He did." Calloway looked at her directly. "And you've continued his work?" "I've done what needed doing." Calloway looked at Nathaniel. "You vouch for her account of events: the checkpoint, Aldridge's visit, the county writ, Marcus received." "Every word," Nathaniel said. Calloway picked up the surveyor's report, the one Whitaker had commissioned 3 years ago, the one that proved he had known about the river's value long before he approached the Bennett family. He held it at a slight angle, examining something near the bottom of the page that Clara had flagged with a small strip of cloth. "This seal," he said. "County Surveyor's Office. I know the man who held that position 3 years ago." He set it down. "He no longer holds it. He left under circumstances that were described publicly as retirement and were not." Clara and Nathaniel looked at each other. "What circumstances?" Nathaniel asked. "A complaint was filed against him by a property owner in the Eastern Valley, alleged that he had provided falsified survey results in connection with a land dispute. The complaint was quietly withdrawn 6 weeks after filing." Calloway folded his hands on the desk. "The property in question involved a water access dispute. The buyer, once the dispute was resolved, was a holding company registered in Kansas City. The silence in the room shifted. Clara said it first. "Whitaker owns the holding company." "I believe so. I cannot yet prove so, but that—" Calloway touched the surveyor's report, "combined with your father's annotations and the original payment records, gives me the beginning of a documented pattern rather than an isolated incident." He looked at her steadily. "And a documented pattern is what changes a fraud case into something considerably larger." "The federal marshal," Clara said. Calloway's letter mentioned Marshal David Reese, Calloway said. "He's been building a file on land fraud operations across 3 territories for the better part of a year. Whitaker is one of 6 names on his list, but the others have left less paper behind. Your father." He touched the annotated ledger almost gently. "Left a great deal of paper, organized, dated specific paper." "When can we meet with Reese?" Nathaniel asked. "He's in Denver now. Has been for 2 weeks." Calloway stood. "I took the liberty of sending him a message this morning after I received your letter from Nathaniel and before I knew exactly what you were carrying. Now that I know—" He looked at the documents spread across his table. "I'd like to see him this afternoon." Clara looked at Nathaniel. He was already looking at her. "This afternoon," she said. "Yes." Marshal David Reese was a compact, quiet man of 45 who did not look like the person responsible for federal land fraud investigations across 3 territories. He looked like a schoolteacher, medium height, careful hands, a face that gave away nothing and invited others to give away everything. He had a habit of letting silences run longer than was comfortable, which Clara identified immediately as a deliberate technique and which she refused to fill unnecessarily. They sat across from him in a small conference room adjacent to the federal building on 16th Street. Calloway sat at the end of the table. Nathaniel sat beside Clara. The documents were arranged between them and Reese, who had been reading for 20 minutes. He looked up. "Your father contacted the county recorder's office," he said. He was looking at one of the letters one Clara had read so many times she could recite it from memory. "About the river access, 14 months ago, 6 weeks before he died," Clara said. "The county recorder at the time was a man named Gerald Pratt." Reese set the letter down carefully. "Pratt left his position 8 months ago. He is currently living in New Mexico. He is also, though this was not publicly disclosed under federal subpoena, in connection with my investigation." The room was very quiet. "He was paid," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "We believe so. We have not yet been able to prove so." Reese looked at her steadily. "Until this morning, when I read Mr. Calloway's message, we did not have a direct evidentiary link between Pratt and Whitaker's land dealings. The surveyor's report your father preserved gives us that link." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly. "How solid is it?" "Solid enough to compel Pratt's testimony if his attorney believes the alternative is federal fraud charges with documented evidence." Reese said this the way he said everything quietly without drama, which made it hit harder rather than softer. A man facing that choice tends to become very helpful. Clara looked at the documents on the table. Her father's handwriting on the margins of the contract. The dates he had written, the words he had underlined, the questions he had written in careful cursive in the spaces between paragraphs. He had done all of this knowing he was sick, knowing the fever was not going away, knowing he might not be the one who finished it. She pressed her thumb against the ledger's spine. "What happens next?" she asked. "We need a proceeding," Reese said. "Not territorial court federal. I have the authority to convene a federal hearing on land fraud under the statute. But to do that I need—" He paused. "I need the primary victim to testify, on record, in person." He looked at Clara. "That's me," she said. "Yes, and I need to advise you honestly about what that means." His voice remained even, but something in it had adjusted slightly, a care that hadn't been there in the purely factual part of the conversation. "It means Whitaker will know exactly where you are and what you're doing. He will have legal representation present. His attorneys will attempt to discredit your account, your father's documents, and your motives. It will not be comfortable." "I didn't come to Denver for comfort," Clara said. Reese studied her for a moment. Then he looked at Calloway. "She'll do." Calloway said, "I know." They were back on Larimer Street when it happened. Clara was walking beside Nathaniel, the satchel over her shoulder. Her mind still moving through the conversation with Reese, cataloging, organizing, preparing the way she always prepared. They were halfway to the hotel Calloway had arranged when Nathaniel stopped. She stopped a half step later and looked back at him. He was looking at the street ahead. His expression had shifted into the stillness she recognized, not calm, but controlled. The distinction mattered. "Don't turn around quickly," he said. "There's a man across the street who has been moving parallel to us since we left the federal building." Clara kept her eyes forward. "Whitaker's. He has the look of it." He started walking again, normal pace. She matched him. "There may be more than one. He couldn't know we were at the federal building. He couldn't know we were at Calloway's office either," Nathaniel said. "But Aldridge came to the ranch, which means someone is tracking movement. If he has contacts in Denver." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Clara thought fast. "Does Calloway have a back entrance?" "I don't know." "The hotel Reese is staying at, is it near here?" 2 blocks. "Then we don't go to our hotel," she said. "We go to Reese's." Nathaniel didn't argue. He turned left at the next corner, moving at a pace that was purposeful without being conspicuous, and Clara matched him stride for stride. She did not look behind her. She had learned in the past 10 days that looking behind you told you where danger was, but cost you the speed needed to stay ahead of it. They reached the Federal Hotel in 4 minutes. The man at the door recognized Nathaniel, or more precisely, recognized the manner of a man with legitimate business, and let them through without challenge. Reese was still in his room. He opened the door, looked at their faces, and stepped back immediately. "Talk," he said. Nathaniel explained in 30 seconds. Reese went to the window, looked out at an angle, and came back. "Brown coat," he said. "I saw him earlier today, near the federal building." Something in his expression hardened very slightly, the controlled anger of a professional who has been anticipated. Whitaker has eyes in Denver, which means he already knows about the investigation or suspects it. "How is that possible?" Clara asked. "It's possible because men with significant financial interests in territorial land transactions sometimes have very good reasons to maintain contacts inside federal offices." Reese said it flatly without inflection. The inflection would have softened what was clearly an infuriating fact. "I've been aware of the possibility of a leak. I did not know it was active." The room went quiet in a particular way. Clara looked at Reese. "He knows I'm here." "He may. Then he knows we're building a case." "Yes." "Which means he's going to move against the proceeding." She was thinking out loud, following the threat to its end. "He'll file something, an injunction, a counterclaim, something designed to slow down the federal hearing long enough to—" She stopped. "Long enough to do what? What does he gain from delay?" Reese and Calloway exchanged a look. "Tell her," Nathaniel said. Calloway said, "There is a mining company currently in negotiation with a land broker for water rights in the Willow Creek Valley. The negotiation closes in 30 days. If Whitaker can maintain legal control of your father's property and the river access through that, closing the sale proceeds regardless of what happens in a federal hearing afterward." Clara stared at him. "He doesn't need to win," she said. "He just needs 30 days. "Yes," Calloway said. "Then we don't give him 30 days. She looked at Reese. "How quickly can you convene the federal hearing?" "Procedurally, 2 weeks is the minimum for proper notice." "Then we file in 2 weeks." She looked around the room, at Calloway, at Reese, at Nathaniel. "Whatever he throws at us between now and then, we don't slow down. We don't respond to his delays. We push straight through." Reese looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing something. "The counter filings will require response. Legally, we have to. Then respond fast," she said. "Give me the documents to review tonight. I've been through every page of my father's papers 40 times. I know the exact point of vulnerability in every claim Whitaker's attorneys are likely to make, because I've thought about it from his side as well as mine. I will sit with Calloway tonight, and we will prepare the responses, and tomorrow we will file them, and we will be 2 steps ahead of him instead of 1 step behind." The silence that followed was the kind that comes after someone says something that changes the geometry of a room. Calloway said, "She's right." Reese said, "I know." Nathaniel said nothing. He was looking at her with the expression she could not quite name, the complicated, unguarded one she had been collecting in small pieces over 12 days. It was larger now than it had been, more certain of itself. She looked away before she could examine it too carefully. There was work to do. So, they worked through the night. Calloway's associate brought documents. Clara read them and flagged the vulnerabilities, and Calloway drafted responses, and Clara read those and corrected the ones that didn't use her father's exact language. And Nathaniel made coffee and kept track of the time, and at some point around 2 in the morning said, "You need to eat something." And Clara said, "In a minute." And 40 minutes later, he put a plate of bread and cold chicken directly on top of the page she was reading, which was either overbearing or practical, depending on how you felt about it. And she ate without looking up from the adjacent page, which was probably his actual intention. At 4 in the morning, Calloway set down his pen and looked at what they had built. "This is the most prepared I have ever been for a federal hearing," he said, "and I have been practicing law for 31 years. "Is it enough?" Clara asked. "It is considerably more than enough." He looked at her. "Miss Bennett, your father would be very proud." She pressed her lips together, held the thing that moved through her chest carefully, the way you hold something that might break if gripped too tightly. "Let's make sure it counts," she said. The federal hearing convened 14 days later. Whitaker arrived with 3 attorneys which told Reese everything about how seriously he was taking the threat, and which told Clara everything about how afraid he was, because men who are confident bring 1 lawyer, and men who are afraid bring 3. How was not what she had expected seeing him across a formal proceeding. She had built him in the months of correspondence and negotiation and fear into something larger than a man, into a force, a system, a machine that operated on money and law, and the assumption that people who couldn't afford to fight wouldn't fight. Seeing him across a federal hearing room in his expensive suit with his 3 attorneys, and his careful posture, and his eyes that moved around the room, calculating odds, he was just a man. A smart one, a dangerous one, but a man. That mattered. It mattered because machines can't be shamed. Men can. The lead federal examiner called the proceeding to order. Calloway presented the case in 40 minutes, walking through the documents in the exact sequence Clara had organized them. The original contract, the fraud, the pattern, the surveyor, the county recorder, the holding company, the mining negotiation, and its 30-day window. He was precise and unadorned and utterly devastating the way a very good lawyer is when he has very good evidence. Whitaker's lead attorney moved to dismiss on procedural grounds. Reese overruled it in 2 sentences. The attorney tried a second angle, challenged the admissibility of Thomas Bennett's annotated documents on the grounds that a deceased person's private notations could not be authenticated. Clara was called to the stand. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for every question, every challenge, every attempt to reframe and redirect and diminish. She sat in the witness chair with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she answered every question the way her father had taught her to answer hard questions, clearly, completely, without excess, and without retreat. When Whitaker's attorney asked her to confirm that she had taken the documents from the property without authorization, she said, "The property is mine. The documents were my father's. Taking my own property from my own land is not unauthorized removal. It is ordinary action." When he asked her whether she was motivated by personal animosity toward Mr. Whitaker, following the breakdown of their engagement, she said, "There was no engagement. There was a coercive ultimatum. Those are different things." When he attempted to characterize her flight from Willow Creek as evidence of mental instability, she said, "I left because I had discovered that the man who held a legal claim over my family's land had manufactured that claim through fraud, and I had the documents to prove it, and I needed to reach a place where I could present them without those documents being seized. That is not instability. That is a reasonable response to a documented threat." The attorney paused. He tried a different direction. She followed him there and was ready when he arrived. At the 2-hour mark, Whitaker's lead attorney whispered something to his client. Clara watched Whitaker's face from the witness stand. She watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the same kind of calculation she had seen in every meeting with him. Every letter from his office, every threat wrapped in the language of concern and assistance. She watched him calculate, and she watched him arrive at the number. His attorney stood and said, "We request a brief recess." The examiner granted it. During the recess, Calloway came to her side and said very quietly, "His attorneys are in conference with Reese's people. I believe they're discussing terms." "Terms," Clara repeated. "They want to settle. Full restitution of the Bennett property. Withdrawal of all claims. Financial compensation for the period of fraudulent debt." Calloway looked at her carefully. "And in exchange, Whitaker avoids federal fraud charges." Clara looked across the room to where Nathaniel was standing against the wall. He was watching her. He had been watching her all morning, with the particular attention of someone who knows they cannot intervene in what is happening, but intends to be present for every second of it regardless. She turned back to Calloway. "No," she said. Calloway blinked. "Clara, the Okafors lost 40 acres. There are others. Reese has been building a file for 8 months on 6 names. If Whitaker settles my case privately, none of that stops. He pays me, and he walks out of here, and he finds someone else who can't afford to fight." She kept her voice even, but underneath the evenness was something that had been building for 14 months and was not interested in half measures. "No settlement, full federal proceeding, all of it on record." Calloway studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll inform the examiner." When the recess ended and Whitaker's attorneys returned to the table expecting an answer, Calloway stood and said, "My client declines the settlement offer. We are prepared to continue the proceeding." The look on Whitaker's face in the moment that followed was not rage. It was something more interesting than rage. It was the look of a man who had built his entire operation on the assumption that people would eventually take the path of least resistance, and was confronting for the first time someone who had done the math and chosen differently. He had not prepared for that. That was his final mistake. The examiner's ruling came 3 days later. Reese delivered it to Calloway's office, where Clara and Nathaniel were waiting. He sat across from them and placed the document on the table and said, "Federal fraud established. All property claims by Whitaker's holding company against the Bennett land void. The county writ he filed against Mr. Brooks's property void. Gerald Pratt, the county recorder, has agreed to full cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. The county surveyor who falsified the report is under federal indictment." He paused. "Whitaker himself is facing federal fraud charges across 3 counts. His attorneys are negotiating the terms of his appearance before a federal grand jury." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at the document, at the seal at the bottom, at the language of restitution and fraud and void and established. She thought about her father sitting at his desk in the months before he died, writing notes in the margins of a document that a man had used as a weapon against him. Writing clearly and carefully and without panic. Building something he might not live to use. She thought about Henry Okafor and the 40 acres and the 4 children and the spring. She thought about the hawk she had set with a splinted wing in Nathaniel's kitchen, and how it had sat on the windowsill for 3 days before it flew, and how Nathaniel had watched it go with the expression of a man who understood the difference between holding something and releasing it at the right moment. She breathed in. She breathed out. "The Okafors," she said. "Can they file a claim?" Reese looked at her. Something in his careful schoolteacher's face had shifted a warmth he kept professionally contained but couldn't entirely suppress. With the federal fraud finding as precedent, their claim becomes significantly stronger. "Yes." "Calloway has their address," Nathaniel said. He was looking at Clara. "I gave it to him yesterday." She looked at Nathaniel. He had given Calloway the address. Before the ruling. Before they knew for certain. Because he had been certain anyway, not with hope, but with the specific certainty of a man who has done the work and trusts what the work produces. "Thank you," she said. "It was the right thing to do," he said, simply, without decoration. She looked at him for a long moment in Calloway's office with the ruling on the table between them and Reese gathering his papers, and Calloway already drafting something at his desk and everything they had built over the past 16 days, sitting in the air between them. And the question she had not yet asked, the one that existed in the pauses and the coffee cups, and the shoulder she had slept against on the night drive. And his face when she was setting the hawk's wing, sitting there too present and patient, and waiting for the right moment. This was not yet that moment, but it was close. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather, not seeing it yet, but knowing with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has learned to read the country that it is coming. She picked up her satchel. She picked up her father's ledger. She held it against her chest for just a moment. The worn cover, the weight of it, the careful handwriting inside that had crossed 14 months and a federal hearing and a night drive through the Colorado dark, and arrived finally exactly where it needed to be. Then she put it back in the bag. There was still one thing left to do. The drive back to Willow Creek took 2 days. They did not hurry. Not because there was no urgency left. There was still the property to formally reclaim, still the county records to correct, still the practical machinery of restitution that Calloway had described as straightforward but time-consuming. But because something had changed in the quality of the journey. The road north felt different from the road south. The road south had been a flight. The road north was a return. Clara noticed the difference in her own body first. The way she was sitting, not braced, not holding herself together against the possibility of disaster, but simply present. The way she was breathing. The way she could look at the country around her without calculating its usefulness as cover. Nathaniel noticed it too. She could tell because he was quieter than usual, and his quiet had shifted from the functional silence of a man managing a situation to the more expansive silence of a man who is no longer managing anything and is not entirely sure what to do with the stillness. They were an hour outside Denver when he said, "What are you going to do with the land?" Clara had been thinking about this since the ruling. She had been thinking about it the way she thought about everything important from multiple angles, following each possibility to its end, checking it for structural weakness before committing to it. "Keep it," she said. "Work it." She paused. "My father built something on that land. I'm not going to let the fact that someone tried to take it change what it was. It'll be hard to run alone. I know." She looked straight ahead. "I've been thinking about that." Nathaniel said nothing. The horses kept their pace. "My father had a standing arrangement with 2 families on the eastern side of the valley," Clara continued. "The Chens and the Garcias. Seasonal labor in exchange for water access from the river tributary. Whitaker's claims disrupted that arrangement. If the water access is restored, which it now is, those families will likely want to resume it." "Likely," Nathaniel agreed. "And I know how to run a farm. I've known since I was 12. I'm not walking into this blind." "I know you're not." She glanced at him. "You sound like you're about to say something." "I'm thinking about how to say it." This was, she had learned, a specific condition with Nathaniel, different from not having something to say, which he also experienced frequently and comfortably. This was the state of having something to say that required careful handling. She had seen it twice before. Once when he told her about Anna. Once when he said the thing about hoping rather than waiting. She did not rush him. The horses moved. The road unrolled ahead of them. The Colorado country spread out on both sides, wide and indifferent, and extraordinarily beautiful in the way of things that don't know or care whether you're watching. "I have 14 miles of fence line on the south side of my property that borders your father's land," Nathaniel said. Clara went very still. "I've been meaning to repair it for 2 years, he continued. "I kept putting it off because there was no practical reason to do it urgently, no neighboring operation to coordinate with, no one on the other side." He kept his eyes on the road. There would be reason now. She looked at his profile, the set of his jaw, the careful way he was holding the reins, not tense, just deliberate the way he held everything when it mattered. "Fence repair is a practical matter," she said. "Yes, you're talking about fence repair. Among other things." He glanced at her, then briefed direct the look of a man who has made a decision and is not going to pretend he hasn't. "I'm talking about neighboring operations that have reasons to coordinate. I'm talking about 14 miles of shared boundary. I'm talking about what it would mean practically for two adjacent properties to function in a way that makes both of them stronger. That's a very careful way of describing something, Clara said. I'm a careful man. I've noticed. He looked at her again longer this time. Is that a problem? She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her chest had moved the thing that had been moving in small increments for 17 days, shifting degree by degree from the closed position she had locked it into after 6 months of Whittaker, back towards something she had thought was too damaged to function. No, she said. It's not a problem. Careful is good. Careful means you mean what you say. I always mean what I say. I know. She looked forward again. That's why I'm still sitting here. The silence after that was not empty. It was the kind of silence that follows a thing being acknowledged, not settled, not resolved, not yet arrived at its destination, but named. Given enough form to be worked with. Clara reached into the satchel and found the ledger by touch. She held it without opening it, just held it the worn cover and the weight of it, the way she had held it the night after the ruling in Calloway's office. He would have liked this, she said. Nathaniel didn't ask who she meant. Yes, he said. I think he would have. They reached Willow Creek in the early afternoon of the second day. Calloway had sent a telegram ahead. The federal ruling the voided claims, the formal restoration of the Bennett property, which meant that by the time they drove into town, the news had been there for 24 hours. Clara felt the difference the moment they crossed the main street. People looked at her differently. Not all of them. Some of the same faces that had watched Whittaker's men search carriages at the checkpoint without protest were now watching her with the particular careful neutrality of people who have been on the wrong side of something and are hoping you won't hold it against them. She didn't hold it against them. She understood how it worked. How a man with money and legal machinery makes himself look like certainty, and how people who cannot afford to bet against certainty tend to stay quiet. But there were others. The woman who ran the general store. A Mrs. Hendricks who had known Thomas Bennett for 15 years came out to the street and took Clara's hands in both of hers and said, "Your father was a good man. He deserved better." And Clara said, "He got it in the end." And Mrs. Hendricks looked at her for a moment and then looked at Nathaniel on the carriage seat and said, "So did you, I think." The minister came out of the church and shook Nathaniel's hand and said something quiet that Clara couldn't hear, to which Nathaniel simply nodded. The county deputy, not the one with the crooked badge from the checkpoint, but his superior, a man named Aldridge Sr., who had apparently been deeply unhappy about his deputy's cooperation with Whittaker's search operation, came to them formally in the street and said to Clara, "The county wishes to express its regret for the role that certain county officials played in the circumstances you experienced. It is not adequate, but it is sincere." Clara said, "Make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. That's adequate." He nodded. He understood she meant it. Whittaker's office on the main street was closed. The windows were dark. The sign that had said Whittaker Land and Development was still in the window, but the words felt different now, like the name of something that used to be a threat and had been reduced by truth and procedure and a woman who refused to take the settlement to just letters on glass. They drove out to the Bennett property in the late afternoon. Clara had not been back since the morning she ran. 17 days ago, though it felt in the way that intense time always does, like both much longer and much less. She climbed down from the carriage before it had fully stopped. She stood on the property that had been her father's and was now hers again, and was going to remain hers. And she breathed in the cold air coming off the northeast corner where the river tributary ran, and she did not cry. She had thought she might. She had been somewhat prepared for it. But what she felt instead of tears was something more solid than grief, more like the sensation of a weight being set down correctly after being carried at the wrong angle for too long. A rightness. A settling. Nathaniel stood a short distance behind her and said nothing. She walked to the edge of the property line. She could see the wooden marker post her father had set years ago. Still there, a little weathered, the letters TB carved into the top in the way her father used to mark everything that was his. She touched the post. She kept her hand on it for a long moment. Then she turned around. Nathaniel was watching her with the expression she had been collecting in pieces since the carriage, and now had enough of to understand. It was not complicated, she realized. She had been treating it as complicated because it was layered, but the thing underneath all the layers was simple. It was the expression of a man who has found something he didn't know he was looking for. She walked back to where he was standing. "Thank you," she said, "for all 17 days of it. You did the work," he said. "I drove the carriage. You did considerably more than drive the carriage, and you know it." He looked at her directly. "Yes, I know it." She held his gaze. "I want to ask you something." "All right." "The fence line you mentioned, the 14 miles, the neighboring operations." She watched his face. "Is that what you meant? Or is that how you meant to start saying something else?" The silence before he answered was exactly the right length. Not evasive, not calculated. Just the time of a man who was choosing words the way he chose everything carefully once with the intention of meaning them permanently. "I meant both," he said. "The fence line is real. The neighboring operations are real. And yes," he stopped and then continued in the voice he used when he was being most honest, which was quieter than his regular voice and more direct. "Yes, I was also saying something else." Clara did not look away. "Then say it clearly." He looked at her for a long moment in the late afternoon light on the edge of her father's land, with the river running somewhere in the northeast corner, and the fence line 14 miles away that had not been repaired for 2 years. "I would like to continue," he said. "Whatever this is, however it needs to go. I would like to not have it end because the emergency is over." She studied him. She studied the steadiness of his face and the honesty of his words, and the 17 days she had spent watching him make choices that cost him something without once behaving as though he expected to be repaid. She thought about what it meant to trust someone carefully instead of blindly. To open a door, or not because you were naive, but because the evidence was sufficient and the person on the other side had proved repeatedly and without performance that they were worth letting in. She had learned the difference. She knew which one this was. "I would like that too," she said. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically the way things shift in stories. Just the small, real shift of a man who has been holding something very still for a careful, reasonable amount of time, and has just been told he can put it down. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. And that was all, and it was enough, and neither of them needed more words than that to understand exactly what had just been decided. Marcus was waiting at the ranch when they returned. He had made stew. He looked at the two of them when they came through the door, the specific way he looked at things that had changed while he wasn't watching, with the unhurried assessment of a man who had been paying attention for 9 years and had strong opinions about what he was seeing. He served the stew without comment. Then he said, "Hawk's gone." Clara looked up. "The red tail, left this morning, flew north." Marcus sat down across from them. Sat on the windowsill for about an hour first, then went. Clara looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at her. She thought about what she had said to herself the morning she set the wing, that she had done this often, that it was ordinary that she knew how. She thought about how Nathaniel had come in and seen her with the hawk, and gone still with that unguarded look she had spent 17 days cataloging. She thought about the difference between holding something and releasing it at the right moment. "Good," she said. Marcus ate his stew. "Seemed fine to me too." 3 weeks later, Josephine Okafor wrote a letter. It came addressed to Clara Bennett, care of the Brooks Ranch, which was the address Calloway had used when he contacted Henry in Kansas City. The letter was 3 pages long, written in a careful hand, and it said a great many things. Gratitude, relief, the complicated emotion of being told that the thing you had given up fighting for could be fought for again. But the line that stayed with Clara was near the end. "Henry says he is afraid to hope. I told him that is all right. Someone hoped on our behalf when we could not, and that was enough to begin. Now we can hope for ourselves." Clara read the letter at the kitchen table. Nathaniel was across from her. She passed it to him when she finished and watched his face as he read. When he set it down, he said, "Calloway is filing their claim next week." "I know." She looked at the letter. "It might take months." "Probably will. And Whitaker's federal case will take longer. Yes. And the county assessor's involvement still needs to be fully documented. Reese is handling it. She looked up. There's a lot of unfinished business. There always is, Nathaniel said. That's different from it not being finished. She looked at him across the table, the same table where they had drunk coffee on the first morning and eaten breakfast in the quiet that was not uncomfortable, and where she had spread her father's papers, and he had pushed food onto the pages she was reading, and where Marcus had served stew on the night they came back from Denver. The table had accumulated a lot of mornings. She thought she would like to add more to it. I need to go back to the property tomorrow, she said. Start the inventory. See what needs to be done before the season changes. I'll come. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He said it the way he said everything, simply without requiring her to read between the lines. I want to, and the fence line is on the way. She almost smiled. The fence line. It needs repairing, he said. Perfectly serious. Of course it does, she said. And this time she did smile, not the small, controlled, almost smile she had permitted herself in careful increments over the past 3 weeks, but the full one, the one she had forgotten. She had the one that arrived without her planning it and changed her face entirely. Nathaniel looked at it. He looked at it the way he had looked at the hawk the morning she was tending its wing, with that complicated, unguarded expression she had spent 17 days collecting, and could now read completely. It was not complicated at all, she understood. It was simply a man who had been alone for a long time, looking at something that made the aloneness feel like a thing that was over. 6 months later, the Okafors came back to Colorado. Henry had aged in the way that hard years age people, not less of himself, but more concentrated, the way metal gets denser after it's been through enough heat. He stood on the edge of his 40 acres and was quiet for a long time, and then he said, I didn't think I'd see this again. Clara stood beside him. Neither did I, about my own. He looked at her. How did you do it? I had my father's papers, she said, and I got into the right person's carriage. Henry looked at Nathaniel, who was standing a short distance away with Marcus, the two of them talking in the unhurried way of men who are comfortable with silence and don't fill it unnecessarily. Good man, Henry asked. The best kind, Clara said. The kind who doesn't announce it. On the first day of spring, Nathaniel fixed the fence line. Clara worked alongside him, not because he needed the help. The fence repair was manageable alone, but because she had decided over the winter that she was not going to be the kind of person who stood back from things she could participate in. She had been doing that for too long, letting things happen at a distance and then dealing with the results. She was done with distance. They worked through the morning in the cold that still had winter in it, even though the calendar had moved on. They replaced 12 posts and restrung 4 sections of wire, and argued mildly about the proper tension for the 3rd section, until Nathaniel demonstrated it and was right, and Clara said, Fine, you're right about the wire tension. And Nathaniel said, You can say that again. And she said, I won't be doing that. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard it, the full version unguarded, without any of the careful management he usually applied to his own reactions. It was a good laugh, genuine and warm and slightly surprised at itself, like a thing that had been stored away and wasn't entirely sure of its footing yet. She liked it. She intended to hear it regularly. When the fence was done, they stood together on the boundary line between his land and hers, or what had been the boundary, or what would still technically be the boundary, the legal distinction growing more theoretical by the day, and looked at what they had built. Good fence, she said. Strong fence, he agreed. She looked at him. I want to tell you something. All right. When I got into your carriage, she began. You didn't know it was mine, he said. No, I just needed to not be found. She looked at the fence line. But I've thought about it a great deal since then. About what would have happened if it had been any other carriage, any other man. She paused. I don't think it would have gone this way. Probably not, he agreed. What I mean is, she stopped. Tried again. What I mean is that the carriage was an accident, but everything after it wasn't. She looked at him directly. Everything after it was a choice. yours and mine both. And I want you to know that I know the difference, and I don't take it lightly." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with the full version of the expression she had been cataloging. Nothing held back. Nothing managed, the whole of it present and clear. "I know you don't," he said. "You don't take anything lightly." "Is that a flaw?" "No," he said. "It's the thing that made all of it possible." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically. Not with the weight of a gesture designed to be remembered. Just her hand in his fingers, closing around fingers, the simple ordinary warmth of two people who have decided clearly, and without confusion, that this is where they belong. His hand closed around hers. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. Later, people in Willow Creek would tell the story, the way people tell stories that have become something between history and legend. They would talk about the woman who had run, and the man who had helped her, and the powerful man who had believed that fear was a permanent weapon and had been proven wrong. They would talk about the Okafor's land being restored, and the county recorder who had cooperated with federal investigators, and the mining deal that never closed because the water rights never transferred. They told the story often and with the particular satisfaction of people recounting a thing that ended correctly. But the people who knew them, Ruth Hadley, who asked no questions but noticed everything. Marcus, who had served stew on the right night without being asked. Robert Calloway, who had worked through the night on a case he believed in. Marshall Reese, who had been waiting for exactly the right evidence to close a file that had been open too long. Those people told a different part of the story. They told the part about the woman who had gotten into a stranger's carriage with one boot and a bag of her father's papers, and the absolute refusal to be finished before she had won. They told the part about the man who had looked at a frightened stranger and thought, "Not again. Not if I can stop it." They told about the fence line that got repaired in the first week of spring and the two properties on either side of it that functioned from that season forward as one. And the people who heard it understood the way you understand things that are true, in a way that goes beyond the facts, that this was not a story about rescue. It was never about rescue. It was a story about two people who each had what the other needed to be whole. Not as a weakness, not as a deficiency, but as the simple human condition of being a person rather than a closed system, and who recognized this in each other at the exact moment when recognition mattered most. Clara Bennett had never needed saving. She needed someone who understood the difference between offering help and offering to carry a weight she was entirely capable of carrying herself. Someone who would stand beside her, not in front of her. Someone who meant what he said the first time he said it, and didn't require her to verify it repeatedly. She found him in Willow Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1888, hiding in plain sight behind 14 miles of unrepaired fence, and the quiet, absolute reliability of a man who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for someone worth being reliable for. And Nathaniel Brooks, who had spent 4 years building a life that was sufficient and safe, and completely, correctly, undeniably lonely, found something he had stopped believing was available to him a second time. Not a replacement. Not a consolation. Something new and specific and entirely its own. A woman who had gotten into his carriage with nothing but her father's truth and her own courage, and who had turned both into something that lasted. The woman who had whispered, "Pretend I'm your wife until we get out of town," was never pretending. Not about her strength. Not about what she was worth. Not about what she was capable of when someone gave her the ground to stand on. She had always known exactly who she was. She just needed a man brave enough and quiet enough and steady enough and good enough to stand beside her long enough to watch her prove it. Nathaniel Brooks was that man. And they built something together on that land on both sides of a strong fence line that no one ever tried to take from them again.